my screen. There we go. I was delighted to be asked to chair this particular session, and like yourselves, I am really looking forward to hearing our guest speakers about her work. And therefore, I'd like to welcome you to Exploring Resilience in the UK Seafood System, which is a seminar hosted by the Global Food and Environment Institute, and it'll be presented by my colleague, Dr. Rebecca St Clair, who is a lecturer in sustainable food systems here at the University of Leeds. Rebecca is an interdisciplinary researcher. She holds a degree in physiology from the University of Liverpool and an MSc in history of science, medicine and technology from Imperial College. She did a PhD at the University of Salford, where she worked with a community food project to research the impacts of community growing schemes, drawing on critical geography and food justice literature to investigate the role of top-down urban agriculture projects in an area of high deprivation during a period of austerity in the United Kingdom. On completion of her PhD, Rebecca worked at Manchester Metropolitan University as a research associate in sustainable food systems, supporting the development of regional policies for building sustainable food chains. Prior to joining us here at Leeds, she also worked as a research associate in circular economy at Manchester University's Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, where she worked on a range of projects relating to seafood, circular economy, food systems resilience, and plastic waste management. Rebecca is also a Fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and Secretary of the Society's Food Geographies Research Group. We're very lucky to have her at Leeds, and she's doing great research, continuing her great research, which is focused around the creation of sustainable and resilient food systems, urban agriculture, circular economy, and development of local and regional food policy. Before I hand over to Rebecca, for those who aren't familiar with our webinar host, the Global Food and Environment Institute, it's an interdisciplinary research community bringing together members and stakeholders from across academia, industry and public policy to actively work on the many integrated challenges and issues around food security and climate change. More information, as our slide says, can be found on our website, which is www.leeds.ac.uk/global food. As has been mentioned in the chat, this is a series of seminars, so check the chat function for news on more events or look at our Eventbrite webpage. And you can also, during this session and maybe afterwards, check out our Twitter feed, which is @GlobalFoodLeeds. Before I hand over to Rebecca, I will remind you of the etiquette of webinars. We've had it displayed on the first slide there, but please ensure that your camera and microphone remain off for the period of the presentation, which will be around 20 minutes. Secondly, if you have any questions for Rebecca, please place them in the chat function and address them to everyone. That is, firstly, so hopefully we generate some discussion within the broader group that's taking part in the presentation, and secondly, to allow me to target some questions for Rebecca at the end, where we will have about around 10 minutes to get her more thoughts on her presentation, her research. Lastly, may I remind you that this session is being recorded, as you've probably seen with the warning we got a few seconds earlier. So with no further delay from me, I'm delighted to pass on to our speaker, Rebecca.
Thanks, Paul. So hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm, as Paul said, a lecturer in sustainable food systems here in Leeds. I've been working here for just about 9 months, and I teach on the MSc in Sustainable Food Systems. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to share some of my research with you all, and I'm really grateful to the GFEI for giving me the opportunity. Thank you to Penny for organising this session, and also to Paul for agreeing to chair it. So today I'm going to talk about 2 different research projects that consider the resilience of businesses within the UK seafood system. I worked on both of these projects at Manchester University with Maria Sharmina, who is a professor of energy and sustainability there. And with the first project that I'll talk about, I also worked with Carly Fletcher, who is a research associate at Manchester Metropolitan University, and Demetrius Papas, who is a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast. So everything that I'm presenting today is very much a team effort. So just by way of a quick introduction, I'll begin my talk by giving a really brief overview of the UK seafood system in a very sort of basic way. The first project I'll talk about is called Diversifood, where we looked at seafood businesses from the perspective of circular economy and resilience. And the second project I'll talk about is called Rise Up, which looked at the impacts and the responses of UK seafood businesses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So before I talk more specifically about our work, I thought I'd attempt some sort of overview or map of the UK seafood supply chain to help with a little bit of context for those who aren't too familiar. So here's a diagram that represents various sections of the UK seafood supply chain. On the left, coming in from into the system, are imports. Most of the fish that we eat in the UK comes from overseas, so this is significant in this context. Underneath the imports is wild capture, and this is a seafood that's caught from the wild, and aquaculture is farmed fish. The middle section of the diagram sees seafood go through ports and markets and primary processing, which includes things like filleting, cleaning and gutting, and secondary processing, which tends to refer to value-added processes such as breading, smoking, and ready meals. Intermediaries refer broadly to brokers, distributors, consultants, and anyone who sort of sits in between. And the right-hand side is towards the consumer side of things, so food service, such as restaurants, cafes, canteens, takeaways, retail, which includes fishmongers and supermarkets, and exporters. So this is obviously a simplification, and the reality of the system is much more complex, but hopefully it gives you a general idea of the areas of business that make up the sector in the UK. So as a bit more of an overview, approximately 80% of the seafood sold in the UK comprises just 5 varieties. So in the UK, we tend to eat salmon, cod, haddock, prawns, and tuna. And most of the seafood UK consumers eat is imported from other countries. Most of the seafood caught and farmed in UK waters is exported, with salmon being the 3rd biggest UK food or drink export after whiskey and chocolate by value. I think cheese follows quite closely after that. And salmon farming is a growing industry in the UK, in Scotland in particular. And while salmon farming provides us with a supply of increasingly affordable fish, its intensive production, particularly as a monoculture, can have a detrimental effect on surrounding environments through things like pollution and disease. And I think all of these issues here raise some quite interesting questions about the resilience of the sector. For instance, as a nation, should the UK consider diversifying its production systems or its business models and consumption habits? So that leads me on to the first project that I'll be talking about today. So the Diversity Food Project, which focuses on the resilience of the UK seafood system, is based on the premise that a diversified seafood system can contribute to a healthy and sustainable diets in the UK. The project ran between 2019 and 2021, and it was led by the Scottish Association for Marine Science. We also worked with project partners at Newcastle and Greenwich universities. At Manchester, we researched business models in the seafood sector, and we wanted to explore the environmental sustainability of UK seafood businesses and their ability to survive in the face of disruptions to the system. And we approached this through the lenses of circular economy and resilience principles. So in our work, we think of circular economy as broadly as a means of moving away from the linear system of taking, making and wasting to a more circular approach that tries to design waste and pollution out of systems to keep products and materials in use for longer where possible and to regenerate natural systems. In the context of seafood businesses, from our perspective, this could include anything from farming systems that cultivate more than one species, where one species can make use of the waste products from another, to using renewable energies from solar panels to power factories, or turning waste products from seafood processing facilities into pet food or some other product. And we've been using a particular framework called iResolve to help us to understand how specific actions can be taken to move towards a more circular system. The iResolve framework is made up of 7 categories that correspond to particular actions that increase circularity, and I'll show that briefly on the next screen. We think of resilience in terms of the capacity to adjust and continue to function in the face of short-term shocks and longer-term stresses. And we've considered the resilience of businesses in the face of specific identified risks, but we've also explored general resilience, which is the ability to respond and adapt to disruptions that haven't previously been identified. And we're also interested in how resilience at the level of the individual business links to the resilience of the wider seafood system. And this is something that I continue to think about. For instance, can business resilience compromise the resilience of the system as a whole? So the first stage of this work was led by Dr. Carly Fletcher, who carried out a systematic review of the literature. And Carly developed a circular economy resilience framework for business models, where she used an aggregated version of the business model canvas, which is a tool for mapping business models, to map out businesses' value propositions, supply chains, customer interfaces, and financial model. She then mapped this against the iResolve circular economy categories, which are down the middle of this diagram. So they're implement, regenerate, share, optimize, loop, virtualize, and exchange. Finally, Carly developed 4 general resilience mechanisms and mapped the whole business rather than just each part of the business model against these. And the key part here is that from this work, we hypothesized that if seafood businesses can increase the circularity of their business models, they may also be able to increase their general resilience. So as I mentioned, that would be their resilience to unforeseen shocks or stresses. So after reviewing the literature, we designed and conducted a survey and online workshops. The survey collected data on the company profile, their business model, their priorities in terms of environmental sustainability, and specific actions they were taking towards increasing the circularity of their activities. The survey asked companies about a range of potential shocks and stresses, such as energy price fluctuation, regulatory changes, climate change, and changes to diet. We also asked companies about their future ambitions and to detail any potential barriers or threats that may negatively impact their ambitions. The workshops were held online. Either 1 or 2 representatives from each company attended 2 workshops 2 weeks apart, lasting 2 hours each. And we held separate workshops for each company so that they didn't have to share any details with any other company. In the workshops, we talked about companies' visions and their priorities for the future, any potential applications of circular economy principles, and short and long-term risks, along with any measures they might take to mitigate those. So this map shows the geographical distribution of our survey and workshop participants. We had 65 survey respondents consisting of 22 retailers, 14 primary producers, 17 wholesalers, 12 processors, 6 exporters or importers, 3 suppliers to the service industry, and 1 seller to intermediaries. And the 6 companies participating in the workshops comprised 2 primary processors who were fish farmers, 2 processors, 1 importer, and 1 retailer. You can only see 5 workshop participants on the right of the screen there because 2 of them were in the same location. It's not as big a sample as we wanted for the survey, and this was partly due to problems that we had due to the timing of the project running at the same time as the COVID lockdown. But it did give us a good spread of businesses across the supply chain, and that's what we wanted, a diversity of different types of businesses. So during the workshops, in order to consider the specific rather than general resilience, we asked businesses to identify both short and long-term risks to their businesses, so up to 1 year or up to 10 years, along with measures that they could take to build resilience against these risks. And in the short term, companies identified industry threats such as food safety scares as a risk. Brexit was identified as a risk that could lead to restricted access to key EU markets, price fluctuations, new procedures and regulations, and difficulties with employment within the sector. COVID-19 was seen as a risk to the service industry and wholesale markets, and processors were also concerned that potential outbreaks could force closure of factories. Any future economic repercussions might also lead to the public having less money to spend on fish, which is seen as a luxury item. Businesses also were concerned about potential increases in taxes, which may cause them to contract their businesses and reduce staff numbers. In the longer term, access to raw materials was seen as a risk, so fish feed for producers or fish for processors and retailers. Changing eating habits was also something that came up quite a bit, the move towards vegetarianism and veganism in particular. Also changing perceptions of fish. So would salmon farming be seen as bad for the environment increasingly in the future, or people increasingly see wild caught fish as contributing to ecocide? Processing site limitations was something that came up. So one company in particular had quite big plans to improve the sustainability of their entire operation, and they needed to move to another site. But this was something that was a big investment and was a long-term investment. Also, consumer demand for sustainable certified products was something that another company thought of as a long-term potential risk for them. So very briefly, the survey found that most companies who responded viewed environmental sustainability as a priority, as a high or medium priority. However, actions that companies were most engaged in, such as recycling and minimizing plastic use, are easier and cheaper to adopt, more visible from a consumer perspective for some businesses, such as retailers, and investing in more substantial changes that may have had a longer term or bigger impact. And in the workshops, we found that circular economy actions identified by companies, both current and future, were generally in line with one or more of the resilience mechanisms in our framework. In terms of risk and measures towards specific resilience, we found that short-term measures tended not to align with circular economy principles, whereas longer-term measures aligned with circular economy principles, specifically those that were linked to regenerating, exchanging, and virtualizing business activities. So we came up with this reactive versus capacity building cycle to sort of try and describe what we were seeing. So where we thought that businesses were identifying short-term risks and implementing risk mitigating measures, they could then survive that immediate risk, but their alignment to circular economy principles was generally not increased. And their general resilience was unlikely to be enhanced. So then they were sort of stuck in this reactive cycle of just responding to the most immediate risk. Whereas if they could plan for longer term risks, then they could increase their circular economy alignment and increase their general resilience and build some capacity to be more resilient in the future. So I'll move on now to the second project that I wanted to talk about. So this was also led, this is the Rise Up project. It was also led by colleagues at SAMS, and we worked in partnership with Seafish in an advisory capacity. At Manchester, we were interested in understanding the impacts and adaptations of the pandemic on seafood processing businesses in the UK. So to go back to the pandemic, generally speaking, there were some fairly well documented impacts on the seafood sector in the early stages of the pandemic in the UK. And here are some headlines reflecting some of the early impacts of the pandemic on the seafood sector. So the UK lockdown, it began in March 2020, which placed UK seafood markets under quite a bit of pressure. The service industry collapsed as eating out ended and export markets were substantially reduced. Most retailers, and particularly supermarkets, did much better from the first lockdown as customers initially stockpiled food. And this also meant that people shifted from buying so much fresh food and switched to frozen, pre-packed and tinned seafood. And price volatility and social distancing measures impacted processors and producers, and imports also declined as a result of the lockdown in other countries and reduced demand from UK consumers. But as lockdown measures eased, businesses began to open up again and rebuild their capacity. And when the service industry reopened, this meant that people could eat in pubs and restaurants again, which eased the pressure on many seafood businesses in the UK. So from the earlier diagram, you can see that the early lockdown caused the service industry to close, and the export market was also severely reduced. So this meant that in order to survive, businesses had to think of ways of getting their product to UK consumers in other ways. So while this is a significant shift that had repercussions for the whole supply chain, we found that much of the literature that explores risks and resilience in the seafood sector, particularly during the pandemic, focuses specifically on producers and retail. There's been very little research to date that looks specifically at businesses in the processing part of the seafood system. So for that reason, and following discussions with our project partners and advisory partner, we decided to focus particularly on seafood processing businesses. So we work with our colleagues at SAMS, and we've taken advice from Seafish to develop our research questions and our interview guide and to select appropriate businesses to speak to. And through this research, we explored how seafood processing businesses in the UK were impacted by COVID-19, whether they changed their activities to adapt to COVID-19 disruptions, and whether these adaptations have affected the environmental sustainability of their business or related operations. So we conducted interviews with a range of processing businesses in the UK. We wanted to speak to companies of different sizes and those that caught and process shellfish and those that process fish. We aimed to speak to a combination of businesses who process largely UK caught produce for the export market and businesses who process imported fish for the domestic market. The fish processors we interviewed were all based in processing hubs in the northeast of England, typically surrounded by a network of shared infrastructure. 2 shellfish companies that we interviewed were based in the north of Scotland, and 2 were based in the south of England. So this is just a very sort of general diagram of some of the findings from our interviews on the impacts of COVID-19. I think I'm running a bit short of time, so I'll just briefly go through a couple. So we found that businesses were impacted by routes to market being essentially closed off. So there were changes to import rules, the export market closed, service industry closed, the supermarket fish counters closed as well. Internal impacts for businesses included a reduced capacity, some factory closures and staff leaving or some staff contracting COVID-19. Distribution was also an issue because of lack of HGV drivers. And in terms of environmental impacts, some companies noticed a higher electricity use because of change of product, which was more energy intensive to process. Also, companies talked about going on fewer international flights that they might have done for business previously, and perhaps seeing that as a long-term change as well. Some companies had mid to long-term plans to improve environmental sustainability halted because of the investment that was no longer there, or because of the time capacity they didn't have to put into these new measures. And in terms of responses to COVID-19, there were quite a few different responses that different businesses talked about. In particular, finding new routes to market were quite important. So looking at home delivery or using fish vans, or going straight to retail rather than emphasizing their product, rather than sending most of their product to the service industry. Internal changes were also really important. So things like changing shift patterns and break patterns, social distancing within factories, using protective equipment, and some staff going on furlough. In terms of products, some companies changed the product that they were offering. So they some changed the size of the product, some changed the type of seafood they were offering altogether. So to go back to the interview sample, I think I've just got time to just quickly summarize what we found with some of these groups of participants. So for the first participant on the left there, which is a business that was processing fish from UK and imported sources to the UK market, we found that they had no real supply issues. Most of the fish that they had was farmed and from the UK. They could freeze stock, so didn't need to waste anything. They lost some business that was due to be wholesale and retail business, but they boosted their retail, so they did quite well. Generally, where businesses had quite a diverse customer base, they managed to adapt quite quickly, and all 3 of these businesses had no real issues with supply, and were able to find different routes. to market. With the two in the middle, which were multi-site national processes, the first had more issues with supply after COVID than during COVID. They have a very diverse supplier base. They deal entirely in frozen. They sell to wholesalers in the service industry, and they felt they weren't really impacted as they're able to just balance the risks and adjust their product. The second there had a diverse set of suppliers, but was quite reliant on sales to the service industry, and they had to close and rely on furlough for longer than the others that we spoke to. And with the shellfish businesses, the first one there sold mostly oysters and scallops, mostly for the service industry, and they shifted to online sales to a third party. So they managed to cope there by finding a different route to market. The second one was a very niche market, producers of native oysters, and they were just becoming ready to trade when COVID hit. And they did have online sales set up, but they weren't making enough money through that. So they pivoted entirely to restoration work rather than selling oysters. The third one, again, deals mostly in frozen, so they had no real problems with their supply, but the export market did suffer, and they shifted their products to target a different export market. And the fourth one was a larger company with global connections, and they traded in four main types of seafood, and they switched from scallops to whelk, and they closed their factory for a short while, and then had an outbreak in the factory which set them back, but they managed to get back on track again by changing their product to suit where they could export to. So just to conclude, I think I have a moment. So the UK seafood system is highly import and export dependent, and seafood consumption in the UK is not particularly diverse. Seafood businesses do appear to be good at and very used to adapting to short-term shocks. This is something that lots of people I've spoken to have really emphasised. However, they often have less capacity to prepare for long-term stresses. Circular economy principles might help seafood businesses to build general resilience where they have the capacity, and collaborating across supply chains and diversifying products, suppliers and consumer bases appears to really strengthen resilience. UK seafood processing businesses face several ongoing challenges, including staff recruitment and retention, both following on from COVID and Brexit, and dietary changes towards plant-based products. Also, inflation and rising production costs is something that affects processing businesses, and Brexit-related import and export regulations. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass back to Paul.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really great. I think there was it's a really interesting subject. It raises quite a few questions around business ethics. I noticed that you mentioned that a long-term risk was seen as plant-based or more sustainable diets, which is interesting because then it brings the question: is a circular economy for the seafood industry? Are they suggesting that it's more about the business interest and waste valorization rather than that overall aim of reduction, which is a big thing in circular economy? But we do have a couple of questions, and it relates to this point. I'll go for the first one, which you touched on quickly on your conclusion, and that was, could you say something about labour force implications? Does our workforce that currently exists within the seafood industry, is it equipped to handle some of the suggestions and opportunities that came up in your research, and how does this relate to the smaller fishing boats?
Well, I don't know if I can comment on the smaller fishing boats because really I've been speaking mainly to processors, but labour is a big issue that comes up time and time again, basically for all the businesses that I spoke to, and recruiting and retaining staff is a real problem. A lot of them noticed that they lost staff during COVID, but then they also lost staff as a result of Brexit because a lot of the workforces in these processing companies were from predominantly Eastern European countries who perhaps don't want to be in the UK anymore. And it's the businesses I've spoken to have spoken about trying to recruit local staff, but struggling to get people to apply for the jobs in the first place and for people to stay. And I think some of that is down to sort of, coastal areas that are sometimes areas of quite high deprivation, and people moving out of these areas to go to bigger cities or towns to go to university and suffering brain drain, but also some of these jobs being really hard, and need a lot of a particular kinds of skill, and people just not wanting to necessarily fill these jobs. So that's an issue that I think people are really struggling with. And I don't know what implications that has for being able to implement some of these circular economy principles. It's obviously really difficult. I mean, one of the things that has come up in some of these conversations is the prospect of automation, and people view this in different ways. It could be a positive. It could be a positive thing for the sector or not, depending on how you look at it. But something that came up in these conversations a lot was that the level of skill and dexterity that's required for a lot of these jobs, particularly in the shellfish industry over the fish processing sites, is just something that the equipment and technology isn't quite up to yet, or they haven't found something that's available that does the job as well as a human being. So yeah, these are all really relevant issues, and I don't know if I have any answers, but these are some of my observations.
I think they're really good observations, particularly the point around areas of high deprivation. I think that's been proven, particularly in the UK, that the impact, particularly where I am over in Hull, the impact of the loss of the fishing industry over many years. But in terms of there's 2 or 3 questions that are related again, and they are around climate change and basically moving away from what is perceived as ultimately a unsustainable industry, which is proven by our loss of biodiversity, loss of fish stocks, etc. So can you make a comment on how big a threat did they actually see the potential to move to a plant-based diet, and what capacity or willingness did you see within your research for people to diversify towards maybe seafood or other plant-based alternatives that we could derive from the sea?
Well, to be honest, it was raised as a concern, but I don't know, there weren't many solutions coming from the interviews. I think, I spoke to, I can remember a retailer, particularly a fishmonger, who was saying that he wanted to stock more, plant-based alternatives that came from the sea. But I haven't really seen any particular solutions to the problem, their perceived problem of consumers moving away from eating seafood. I think that the first project that I worked on, the Diversity Food project, whilst we were looking at business models, our partners at SAMS were looking at integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. And so they were looking at the potential for aquaculture, and I think like salmon farming in particular, to become a more sustainable solution to seafood consumption, and by having systems where you can set up some more circular systems where waste doesn't become such an issue and pollution doesn't become such an issue. So I think the solutions coming out of that project were more linked to how can we have a more sustainable seafood system where people can eat fish rather than what are the alternatives to eating fish, I suppose.
We have time for a few more, maybe. There's a second part to there was a second part to Charlie's question, and it maybe relates to the broader concept of circular economy and how you drive it. But how does you touched on that in your conclusion, how does the international dimension impact on the supply and demand, i.e. how much of the UK seafood production and being imported and exported, how much is that influenced by international considerations of circular economy?
I mean that's a good question, but I don't think it's one that we answered or particularly addressed very well in these projects. I'd certainly be interested to hear any thoughts that anyone has on that, but I don't think I can provide a good answer to that question.
I was going to ask, did you notice all other regions were doing better than us, perhaps, or considering it more? Are we perhaps late comers to a circular economy for a seafood industry in this country, do you think?
Again, I don't think I can provide you a good answer to that question. Paul, maybe you can come up with a circular economy in other countries.
Not really, no, but obviously, of course, again, I'll take the example of Hull. If you want to go back to over 100 years ago now, Seven Seas, the nutrient vitamin company, well famous, it started in Hull on the back of processing fish waste from the fish docks. So there's a long history of industrial symbiosis, circular economy, if you like, in these food industries. It's whether we can make them relevant to the 21st century and the climate change issues that have been pointed out. For example, Sol has mentioned about the rising temperatures of the seas and whether that's going to completely change the dynamics anyway. So it's did that come up in your long-term risks? Did people pick up on any significant changes in the sea from climate change? Are they seeing anything now that's affecting how they're going to plan going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I recall any solutions being discussed for, but certainly people talked about the migration of fish stocks north, and how this is a problem, not necessarily because the fish stocks are disappearing that they were targeting, but because they were further out. That was making it's making livelihoods more dangerous in a sense, because they're having to go further out into different places to get the fish that they're targeting. I'm trying to recall one of the interviews. I was speaking to someone and they actually said that they felt like warming waters would be a benefit for them, because it would allow them to sell a particular. My brain's gone completely blank, but there was definitely someone who raised this as a potential benefit to their business. I mean, to go back to your point about circular economy within the UK, certainly the processing businesses that we were speaking to, a few of them were very positive about looking for new ways of reducing waste and making sure that there was no waste coming out of their business. And I suppose that from a business perspective, people want to optimize their activities because they don't, because any lost products is lost profit as well. But these businesses that we were speaking to, I think they sort of self-selected in a way, because they probably wouldn't have wanted to be involved in our project had they not been interested in sustainability. But certainly some of the businesses we spoke to were really driven by very proactive leadership, and wanted to take advantage of opportunities that were available where they could.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think we could go on for a while. It's a subject that it's very interesting, and it's contradictory in some respects in terms of sustainability and what we want to do in the future. And there's lots of ethical, both socially ethical, business ethics questions that can be asked. But I think our time is up. I would suggest if anybody has any lingering questions or has more interest in Rebecca's great work, then please feel free to contact her. I'm sure she'll be happy to speak to you about her research. Otherwise, the Global Food and Environment Institute website, you've got the details of that. And I will thank you all for taking part in this seminar and say goodbye. Thank you very much.